Follow, thanks for being with us today. And thanks for joining us. We're going to give it another minute before we get started as more of our guests join us. Okay, let's get started. Well, welcome and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining the Leadership in the Age of Personalization live stream. Whether you're joining us live from Zoom or YouTube, I'm Glenn Yopes, and on behalf of GLLG, thank you for taking the time to join us today to join the conversation and the interview that we're all going to have with Shawntee Reed. Shawntee is the head of inclusion and diversity at Square, who will discuss our topic today, which is inclusion and diversity. Now, I'd like to remind everyone that this session is a Q&A session. It will not happen at the end, but rather throughout the program. We have GLLG staff on standby, and to submit any questions, please enter them into the Q&A module on the Zoom control panel. GLLG staff will organize the flow of questions to ensure that you can address your thoughts on an open mic. I've been talking about the cultural demographic shift for the past decade. It's my term for what happens when large cultural segments of the population reach numbers sufficient enough to have a significant effect on what we do and how we act. Now, the recent Brookings analysis of the US population concluded the following. 80% of the population identified as white in 1980. But by 2000, that dropped to 69.1%. And by 2019, it's estimated by the US Census to stand at 60.1%. Estimates released by the US Census Bureau ahead of the 2020 results showed that in 2019, more than 50% of those under the age of 16 identified as a minority. In fact, the 2010 to 2020 decade will be the first, or has been the first, in the nation's history in which the white population actually declined. See, the demographics of your workforce are actually changing even faster than we thought. We're just a few years ahead of starting that transition from a majority-minority population. And good leaders will see that that's an opportunity. See, the generations that you're actually relying on to secure your organization's future, see, they'll be more ethnically diverse than ever. See, they want to have impact and influence than any generation before them. They want to contribute to something. See, they're proud of their diversity. They're not going to try to fit into some predetermined definition of a successful employee or a successful leader. Look around. See, we're seeing what's happening within society when people's individuality is ignored for so long. See, people in the workplace just won't stand for being forced to assimilate to anything. And while most leaders see personalization as something they need to adapt to, they're looking at it from the outside and perhaps trying to figure out how to control it. See, that's standardization at work, old habits that slow progress down. See, they're trying to standardize everything to make it easier to manage. But our colleagues and employees from millennial and Gen Z populations, well, they've lived personalization. In fact, they expect it and accept it. In fact, they hardly know anything else. And there's where the good news lies. So if you're struggling to figure out how to lead people who want to influence more, why not learn from them? Start listening to them. They want inclusion. That means they're respected as individuals and invited and enabled to influence the business in their own way. Now, let's remind you all that we're all part of a conversation. And so that means get involved with it, be a part of it. We want our attendees and guests to be at the center of this discussion today with Shawntee Reed. So now I'd like to welcome Shawntee, someone who I deeply respect and admire. You'll see that Shawntee is a special individual. She's very open and she's very forward thinking, always looking to push the boundaries and find ways to be much more inclusive to enable individual capacity. So on that note, Shawntee, it's great to have you here. It is a pleasure and honor. How are you doing today, Shawntee?
I'm doing well. And Glenn, I hope you can hear me okay and see me okay. Is that true?
You know, I can hear you perfectly, but I can't see you.
I am so sorry about that. I'm going to go off and then try to come back on. I do see you. And I apologize if you're not able to see me, but I definitely want to make sure that we continue in the conversation, do not belabor.
No, you know what, Shawntee, if there's one thing I know about the age of personalization, we're no longer in the pursuit of perfection. We're in the pursuit of experimentation so that we can find the right solve and build momentum. So see, it happened. You're here. Great to see you, Shawntee.
Absolutely.
So Shawntee, I think everyone's pretty curious. How does inclusion and diversity take shape inside of a tech company?
So at Square, the I takes
you know what, Shawntee,
and
for
it's really
some
in front of the IND.
I'm sorry, Shawntee, for some reason, there seems to be something technically that's not working, but it's okay. We're going to figure it out. And I know that we've got GLLG on staff. GLLG, you know what I've been recommended is that you leave and then come back and just join us again. Okay, so as you sign off and sign back on, perhaps there's a question from the audience that I can address. So go ahead and just sign off, Shawntee, and then sign back into Zoom, please. Okay, so as we take a little break here before Shawntee rejoins us, is there any questions or anything that I could address with our audience right now? Now, while you're thinking of your question, I'd like to remind everyone that GLLG will be hosting our 2020 Leadership in the Age of Personalization Summit that will take place between October 28th and October 30th. 40 thought leaders across healthcare, corporate America, and higher education will discuss why the collapse of standardization has hit us in today's turbulent times, and why standardization can no longer scale in its current form, and that it must start look for ways to embrace today's age of personalization. In fact, as we wait for Shawntee and get the technical challenges fixed, we're going to show you a little video.
Airports have been empty for several days, and now all stores except for pharmacies and food markets will be closed.
More than 80 million Americans now told to stay at home.
The virus eroding the college dreams for many. What will higher education look like on the other side of this pandemic?
The global economy is facing its biggest crisis in 90 years. The International Monetary Fund says the pandemic and lockdown measures will cause the worst recession since the Great Depression.
We've been watching in real time as one submicroscopic virus renders all standards of human hierarchy meaningless.
Inevitably, in crisis, the leaders who have the biggest impact on the most people are rarely the official leaders at the top.
parts of the city on fire overnight.
State of agony. This as more protests erupt overnight in American cities. The anger growing across the country from New York to Denver to Los Angeles following the death of George Floyd in police custody.
So as we cope with this global catastrophe, what do we want to see from our leaders? Calm resolve, or is it okay, maybe even necessary, to show a little emotion?
Crisis has a way of revealing, course-correcting, and recalibrating what leadership really means.
Okay, well, hopefully that gave everybody food for thought. Those are the things that we're going to be addressing at the summit. I'd like to ask Shawntee to join us again. Shawntee, are you there?
I am here.
There you go. Now it's perfect. Thank you so much, Shawntee.
You're so welcome. And the video, we can start that whenever you're ready. And I can see that my mute is off and you can hear me just fine.
No, you're good. How about your videos? Are you on?
If you can start it on your end, that'd be perfect, the video.
Actually, there's no video. We just showed them a little video of the Age of Personalization summit. And so until we got you back. So now that you're back, that's what we're here for, Shawntee. We're here for you. And so now that you're back, let's start over, shall we? So Shawntee, tell us how inclusion and diversity take shape inside of a tech company. I think there's a lot of curiosity. I'm certainly curious.
Absolutely. So first, Glenn, I want to just say thank you so much for this opportunity. I think the space and the opportunity to connect with the live audience to really talk about things that I know may be top of mind for them when we talk about inclusion, diversity in the workplace. So thank you so much for this. Now, in terms of how I&D has taken shape inside of tech industry, and in particular Square, at Square, we actually put the I in front of the D, meaning inclusion and diversity. And we emphasize that everyone at the company thinks of their role as if they have inclusion and diversity at the end of their title. We launched our blog, which said, we wanted to be candid about inclusion, diversity, and the work that we're doing and show what's working and what isn't working. And we're hoping to prompt other companies to share their successes and failures. And so we can learn from each other in this industry. And how do we continue to move this conversation forward? And we encourage you, to learn more about our work around how we institutionalize diverse candidate slates and our practices to interrupt bias in our promotion and our compensation cycles, and how we're adapting to maintain a sense of connectedness and belonging and more. And for those that are here, you can really find that out on our blog in terms of going deeper into how I&D really takes shape inside of Square.
So can you give our attendees and our guests a URL somewhere that you can point them to? Where can they find your blog?
Absolutely. If you just search Square I&D blog, it will pop up. And there on that blog is information about overarching what inclusion and diversity means to us at Square, that sense of belonging, that deep connectedness, the ways by which we experience to grow and learn. And then at the same time, our annual diversity report can be found there as well in terms of the demographic representation of our talent. And so again, if you just search on Square I&D blog, because the URL is long, then it'll automatically pop up for you.
Perfect. I'd like to go back just a second, Shawntee. Why I before D? And I don't know if you have any views on a broader scope, in that is, why are we struggling to know what letters go where, how, and why? I mean, what is your thought?
Yeah, diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity, inclusion and diversity. I do really believe that in Square, that inclusion was really a manifestation of the employee population. Our employees felt as if, it was important to really center, right, the cultural backgrounds and the set of experiences that each of our employees bring to the company, and really infused in the work that they're doing every day. And so when it comes to our culture adaptation and adoption of inclusion being really at the center of what we're focusing on, meaning creating inclusive leaders, creating inclusive teams, and environments at Square, that's what resonated for our culture. That's not to say that if the D was in front of the I, that wouldn't be the same. It's just what we lead with, is creating that environment that has a sense of inclusion for everyone.
A question, one more on this topic before we shift to the next. Has Square, are you guys at a point now where you're actually able to measure employee experience, or is that still part of the longer term plan? Because I'm finding that it's really, I've often said that today in the age of personalization, creating a safe environment where no one is judged is actually more important than employee engagement. And why is that? Because judgment or lack thereof is really at the core of the employee experience. And it sounds like through inclusion and diversity efforts, you're trying to focus more on building and enriching the totality of the employee experience.
In our culture, in our business, when we're focusing on building and really the importance around communication, I think is where you're going there, Glenn. There is, a company culture, and then there's subcultures across teams and communities. And since the switch, when we think about working from home and when we think about teams and managers and across the company, we've been working to identify ways to maintain a sense of community and connectedness across our employees virtually. And
you know what, Shawntee? You know what we're going to do? We've just been told that your volume is spotty. So if you could just go off of video, we're going to try to bridge this when we reproduce it. Hopefully we can do that. So if you could just go to audio for us, that would be great. So again, tell us a little bit about how you're creating this employee experience by really emphasizing culture within a business and the importance of communication.
Absolutely. So again, culture within the business and the importance of communication, Glenn, thank you. And the technical difficulties are not going to get in the way of us having this conversation.
No,
so I just want to name that. So I apologize to all of you. But culture within a business, as I'm saying here, there is a company culture, but then there's subcultures across teams and communities. And communities for us, that is both internal and external. Internal in terms of our employee resource groups, external in terms of the communities in which we're serving. And since we've switched to working from home, we're talking about the importance of communication. Teams and managers across the company have been working to identify ways to maintain our sense of community and to connect with our employees virtually. Communication and providing employees with the information they need to be successful, right, is incredibly important. For example, our internal communications team, Glenn, rolled out new formats to keep us informed and connected, including regular, like, for example, COVID-19 email updates and a weekly virtual all hands. Our learning and programs teams have developed a range of resources for managers on leading distributed teams and through these times of crisis. And our team leads are surveying their teams to make sure that we continue to stay connected and to keep a pulse on how they're navigating and adjusting. So during these times, the culture within our business, we understand communication is critically important during these times.
So it's really interesting. I feel like this role of internal communications when it comes to inclusion and diversity is becoming more and more important. Why is that? I mean, you've given us a perfect example, but this is a function that I think has not been really optimized in the spirit of operationalizing I&D across an organization. Tell us a little bit more about the role that internal communications plays, and then we already have a question on standby for you.
Absolutely. So the role of internal communications is so critical, I think, to any organization, and in particularly inside of our organization. It's important because it is making sure that business leaders have the opportunity to provide information on a regular and consistent basis that in fact gives a business update, right? But at the same time, employees have an opportunity to engage with that information and to consume it in such a way that is going to propel them to either continue to do their job successfully, but then also be able to be attuned and astute to how the business is doing. And when you talk about that's just the business side of it. But beyond that, it is critically important in terms of our internal comms team, which they are the ones that's making sure there's a number of different platforms, Glenn, by which employees can take in information. So what I mean by that is that could be an intranet, like an internal platform where individuals can go to get the resources they need on a regular basis. That could be through the use of Slack groups, which is an opportunity for smaller groups of individuals to come together and engage in different ways. And so our internal comms really do provide us that technical platform support. They partner with the businesses to come up with the communications plan to communicate out how their businesses are doing, and they keep us connected. And so I give a hats off to our team. I especially appreciate our internal comms team because they really are the conduits to make sure that information is flowing to our employees and through our business respectively.
Excellent, Shawntee. So we have a question from you, and this comes from C. Armstead. C, thank you for joining us. I'd like to put you on an open mic to ask Shawntee a question.
Okay, Glenn, can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity, and I am enjoying the conversation so far. As I was typing a previous question, you all started to talk about the sequencing of the letters. The D, the I, the E. And so you addressed some of my thoughts as you were having the initial part of your conversation. Shawntee, I did want to know though, in recent months after the George Floyd killing, the term equity has seemed to have been elevated in the D&I discussion. Has your organization considered incorporating, or have you already incorporated equity and maybe even considering adding it to your I&D label?
See, thank you so much for the question. And in terms of equity and really looking at systemic, right, racism in our practices and our processes, equity is at the forefront of that. I personally can say that the titles is one thing, but the work and the actions behind that title is where I believe it really manifests. See, and so we are not at all considering like adding that E, like the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Instead, as it relates to our systems, our processes, holding space for understanding what those systems, how they impact our employees or even our customers, our sellers, that's what's top of mind for us. And to your point, to support our employees, over the past year, taking into account what you just mentioned in terms of George Floyd and I would say even COVID-19 is wrapped up into that C. We've been very diligent to revisit, right? What are the expanded opportunities that we needed to provide to our employees, meaning the caregiving leave or even just the mental health support and counseling to our employees. And there's things that we either had in practice C or things that we introduced in practice because we were proactively and in some cases reacting, right, to the understanding and the notion of how equity and or systemic racism, how that exists inside organizations and the role that we play in the capacity as an I&D practitioner. So I want to just surmise that by saying equity is how we look. That's the lens by which we are applying when we're looking at our systems, practices, and processes in support of our employees, customers, and sellers.
Thank you so much for that thorough response. Thanks, Glenn.
See, do you have a follow-up, or are you okay?
I'm good.
Thank you very much for being part of the conversation, C. So let's shift gears a bit, Shawntee, and discuss the importance of purpose-driven work. What is Square's purpose for economic empowerment?
Sure, absolutely. So Square's mission is economic empowerment, as you mentioned, Glenn, and we started with a little white reader to accept card payments. And today we are a company that offers two complementary ecosystems of financial tools, one for small businesses and one for consumers. On the small business side, we offer sellers everything they need to start, run, and grow a business. That includes hardware, I would say, point of sale software, payroll, small business loans, marketing tools, and even more. And on the other side, Glenn, Cash App gives individual consumers a suite of tools to help them store, send, spend, and even invest their money. And our goal is financial inclusion, which is at the heart of the mission of economic empowerment, enabling people to participate in the economy. And we do this by making it easier for businesses to accept credit cards without having to go through that arduous process, required by, traditional financial institutions. And we do this through Cash App by giving consumer tools to move or even invest their money. And so for us, it is about financial inclusion. And that's the reason our mission is economic empowerment.
Well, it sounds to me as if you profess to inclusion as a growth strategy. Because if that's what you're propelling through the means of Square's strategy, it's clear that inclusion is at the core of the organization's growth strategy. So Shawntee, let's move on to how do you build communities inside of the organization? I know that employee resource groups are important. Can you maybe explain to those on our call today about how you've designed them, what is their primary focus and role, and how have they helped really enable growth and opportunity for Square and its products and services?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the question. As you heard me say that I am from the D is really as a result of our employees. And our communities are what may be known as familiar for most employee resource groups, have been around a lot longer than our I&D function, Glenn. So Square communities, are a central part of our workplace culture. Initially founded by a small group of dedicated employees passionate about celebrating underrepresented backgrounds within tech. Our communities have grown over the years to include 14 global groups with 79 chairs, which are employees globally. And, they have a robust calendar of programming to ensure that individuals are connected. We administer twice a year a pulse survey, which is an opportunity to understand our level of employees' engagement and ensuring that our employees feel connected and have a sense of belonging. And our communities are individuals that are 100% propelling those efforts. And what I wanted people to say is that, again, this is an unusual year for us. And so when we think about COVID-19, our communities had work to do three things, Glenn: maintain consistency, address the key needs of employees, and really come together. And if I can expand on those a little bit, I think that would really give some context as to how employee resource groups inform cultures inside organizations. So when it came to maintaining consistency, Glenn, one of the first challenges we faced in the new work from home reality was how to orchestrate events, right? Between International Women's Day celebration events planned by our interfaith communities in April, or even regular community lunch and learns, if you will, the event calendar was full of programming. Though the current situation clearly wasn't a business as usual experience. We've tried to maintain some of that sense of consistency and normalcy, especially as it relates to opportunities to connect with one another. And then when it came to addressing key needs of employees, And keeping an eye on, like I mentioned, we use Slack as an internal communications platform. Our communities were keeping a close eye, right, on what were the employees' experiences, what were their communications surrounding how they were feeling, carrying out their day-to-day work, but also in response to what happening in the world. And so in partnership with our communities, we identified some opportunities to provide information and support. And that resulted in new resources for our parents, right? Having to work from home and providing support to our leads and how to support parents who were now having to be teachers and educators. And then we also provided resource documents for mental health. We understood that in light of, as Steve mentioned, with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the civil unrest, that we understood our Black employees were having a set of challenges and experiences not unique to them every day, but having to come to work and show up while that was going on. And we understood that our communities had a perspective. They had a lens into that. And so they helped us understand as a company what additional resources we needed to consider. And we were able to develop that. And then the last thing I'll say, Glenn, in terms of the coming together, since the number of our in-person community events shifted to virtual formats, our community saw an opportunity to reallocate a portion of our funds that were originally dedicated towards in-person events. And so our community chairs, I'm so happy to say this, partnered to team up with our in-house creative team, and we developed an item, which we consider swag, right? Which was perfect work from home life. We had to sell around Square Cares, and this was ensuring that nonprofit organizations had additional funds through fundraising for COVID-19 relief. And so our communities are at the center, Glenn, of really creating a sense of belonging for our employees, helping us further evaluate what an inclusive culture means. And as I mentioned to you, our blog, you can learn more, even more about our communities, to some of the work that they've done by visiting our Square blog as well.
Excellent, Shawntee. Now, I have a follow-up, but before I go there, I'm actually going to ask one of our guests to join the conversation, and hopefully he'll be up for it. Troy Carlton, are you there? Troy, do you want to join us live?
All right. Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly. Hi, Troy. How are you?
Hey, I'm partly cloudy, mostly sunny, Glenn.
Well,
I love
it. So Troy, why don't you introduce yourself to Shawntee, let her know what you do and the role that you play in this conversation in your organization.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to join you guys, and I was listening with much attention. And Shawntee, I really want to thank you for a great discussion so far. So I'm Troy Charlton, Director of Inventory Planning and Supply Chain at CVS Health. I sit at our headquarters in Rhode Island, and I also am honored to be the co-chair of our National Black Colleague Resource Group. So as you can imagine, when Shawntee, you started talking about the importance of CRGs and what their relevance is to companies and how meaningful they are, my ears poised up, and it's certainly a great opportunity to impact and influence and really sort of help shape the narrative of how companies are addressing, many things that are happening inside and outside of our companies. So I did throw a question up on the Q&A, and I was just, if you don't mind, can I ask that now or?
Oh, you're live, my friend. Go ahead. This is what it's all about.
So, as I said, you may see that question. I was just curious, when you mentioned, George Floyd and COVID and so many other crazy anomalies that have happened this year. 2020 certainly has been much different than any other year in our lives. We had a similar response internally at CVS, where we approached our executive leadership and were very interested from a BCRG perspective, very interested in how our company was going to respond and, quite frankly, change going forward, because this is a new normal. Normal is being defined much differently now. So, we wanted to make sure we captured the spirit of everything that was going on and really addressed, things that were happening in our space, because we have 10,000 stores across the country and 300,000 colleagues across the country, and they live and work in the very communities that were undergoing much of the unrest and everything that was going on. So we felt the need to make sure our executive leadership understood that, displayed some leadership, as displayed empathy where necessary, and really understood the dynamics that people were living through. And BCRG, Black Colleague Resource Group, we took a lead role in bringing that conversation to the forefront. And Glenn, you're familiar certainly with David Casey, our Chief Diversity Officer. We made sure that all of our actions were aligned to the business imperatives that we have, but as well as the social responsibility that we feel we have, being, a large company with a pretty significant footprint across the country. And again, most importantly, with colleagues that go to work, live and breathe and operate in the very communities that were experiencing unrest. So I say all that, Shawntee, just to say I was curious. We did come out with a lot of initiatives and other things that we are putting in place to address it. I was curious, how are you measuring the progress of your company on the key inclusion? And I put I first and then the D, as you said. I was curious, how are you measuring the progress of your company on the key inclusion and diversity metrics that you've chosen? That's one. And then my second question is, how are you making sure the culture of inclusion and diversity truly flows down throughout your company? Because that was certainly an opportunity for us as we got a chance, our national leadership team in the BCRG got a chance to speak to Larry Merlot, our CEO, face to face. Well, I'll say monitor to monitor because we were all virtual. But, it was a very interesting conversation and a very meaningful conversation. And, when you're talking to your CEO and your chief human resources officer, Lisa Basaccia, and when you're having this discussion and, everything sounds great at the 50,000 foot level, but it's a different conversation and a different expectation when that process and that thought has to truly filter down throughout your organization and be embraced, not just hear it, but embrace it. So again, I'll just restate the question. So how are you measuring the progress of your company on the key inclusion and diversity metrics? And then how are you making sure that the culture of inclusion and diversity flows throughout your company? I'd really like to hear your perspective.
Sure, Troy. First of all, listen, your passion resonates a lot with me. And I didn't mention this in my intro, but let me just first name that employee resource groups, CRGs, BRGs are really at the, I would say, the foundation of how I even started along this work in my journey in inclusion and diversity. I too have led employee resource groups, and it is 100% what I can say framed, right, my ideals around the importance of creating a sense of belonging in the workplace, and that cultural backgrounds and experiences are unique to each individual. And so I want to just name that, because being a part of an employee research group is really what propelled me in my career to even expand the conversation like we're having right now of the importance of, to your point, evaluating progress and really understand how culture impacts, every day inside of an organization when we're talking about inclusion. So thank you for sharing that with me. So as you heard me mention a little bit to Glenn about the pulse survey, twice a year when you talk about progress, twice a year, we have our pulse survey that does include questions around inclusion and diversity where we're hearing directly from our employees on their sense of belonging and if they are feeling supported by their lead when it comes to them having a voice in their background and their experiences included in the day-to-day conversations. And so our progress is through the use of that tool to evaluate. And I know companies differ in terms of their employee engagement or having a separate survey that focuses on inclusion, diversity, to which all of that is okay, but having some type of instrument or assessment tool to really get the feedback and from the employees is important. And that is one way by which we measure progress. And once those results come in, we then evaluate that and prepare reports for our leads so they understand what is considered their org health when it comes to inclusion, diversity. And we do that for every lead across our company. Now, that's a form of measuring progress. When we talk about culture and inclusion, and this is where look, Troy, I would love for you to visit our blog, because when we're talking about inclusion, is often an overlooked tenet, right, of building a diverse workforce. It is critical to evaluate the workforce itself, yes, in terms of the demographics, to ensure we're building a company where all employees, both current and potential, feel valued, recognized, and able to succeed, right? Now, that sounds great on paper. But the practice part is really being able to diagnose through the information we receive in terms of where there may be gaps, right, in the organization. And so that means that we are in practice side by side with our leaders to understand what types of programs, right, can help and what types of processes. When we're looking at a very granular level, do we need to explore to help leaders continue to build diverse and inclusive teams? And with that increased accountability, right? Accountability around how we're actually making progress. As reflected in those pulse scores, but then also reflected in the demographics and representation of those teams. And so that's what we are currently doing. And here's what I'll tell you, Troy, because I've been kind of doing the work for a little bit of time, and I've, really explored I&D across a number of different industries. It's not a one size fit all. Every organization will have a unique set of challenges and opportunities. Every single organization will have a very specific business culture and subcultures. And so when you're applying an I&D framework, or you're looking through the lens of I&D relative to system processes and practices, not one organization is going to be the same. So I want to be able to just say, and I know that from practice, this having been across a number of different industries, but what offer to you, Troy, it's progress that's being made over time, and it's okay where a organization hasn't completely arrived, because this is work that we work at every day. Would you agree, Troy?
I would indeed. It certainly is not a one and done situation. And I really appreciate that perspective, Shawntee. And I do appreciate your experience in this lane. Again, I'm just leading the BCRG. I don't mean to minimize myself, but I'm leading the BCRG and co-leading it. And, we just wanted to make sure that our company, again, views it with the right perspective, to your point, through the right lens. And, we wanted to make sure that our executive leadership is not treating inclusion and diversity like a project with a start and end date. It's really got to be the culture, and that, as you said, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a walk, a crawl, walk, run type of approach. But as long as we're making progress, and that's what I wanted to just, get your opinion about, is how do you know that you're making progress, definitively? We went as far as to actually putting a resource, an actual colleague in a role whose job function, Glenn, is a person who actually reports up through David Casey now, to make sure that we have a good view of what's happening, what gets measured gets done. That was actually our CEO's quote. And we wanted to make sure that we, are keeping our eyes on the prize, in a sense, and making sure we're not losing sight and making it a one and done type situation. So really appreciate your answer there, Shawntee.
Absolutely, Troy. Thank you for the question.
Yep.
Oh, sorry about that, Shawntee. Well, Troy, thank you so much for participating. We're going to start wrapping up now, but I wanted to give the audience another shot to become part of the conversation. Eric Ortega, did you want to ask Shawntee a question? You could always pass.
Sure. Thanks for putting me on the spot, Glenn.
No problem. I know that this topic means a lot to you. So just anything, remember, you don't have to be perfect. Just tell, maybe it's something that's on your mind that you wanted to react to.
Yeah, Shawntee, I really appreciate your time. The discussion has been really insightful. My name is Eric Ortega. I work at Cost Plus World Market, and we don't have an I&D team. So this is all very new to us, and I've been supporting the programming for inclusion and diversity, which has been an amazing experience. And so I guess I just wanted to ask you, for someone that's just kind of starting out in the journey in the world of the I&D space, having been an HR practitioner within other, within like recruitment and some other departments, what advice do you have to propel not only just this opportunity forward, but how to really cultivate and drive that change throughout the entire enterprise, since this is a new endeavor for us?
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much. So when it's not uncommon, I want to name here, where inside organizations, there may not be a formal team and or an individual that is leading the conversation, the accountability, evaluation of metrics inside of an organization. So that's not uncommon. And that does not mean that without that function or that person inside of an organization, that the employees and the leaders do not understand the importance of creating an environment of inclusion and wanting to ensure that individuals from diverse backgrounds are then being considered for employment opportunities at that organization. So I want to name it in the space that while that may not be a formal practice there, Eric, you as an individual inside of the organization is someone that is looking at the employment workforce as that, through that lens of, wow, what more can we be doing? Or what is it that we're not doing today that we perhaps could be or should be doing? And starting from that place, Eric, has what I found to be fundamentally important is figuring out the one thing that you want to go and work on and solve. Oftentimes when you're trying to do a lot of things at one time, and what I know just in my professional career, you can get overwhelmed. And when you're thinking about having an impact in change inside of an organization, when you're talking about inclusion, diversity, we're talking about changing behaviors, mindsets, creating sets of experiences for people inside of a workplace. And you want to start somewhere, right? And for you, you mentioned that, you know, you've been exposed to recruiting, you've been exposed to this. So even if you were to start with recruiting and just ask, you know, in partnership with your talent team, if you're familiar, Eric, with organizations that may be representative of minorities that you want to further expose your company to, then you can start there. And that is as simple as, even in Square, I have employees that would say, oh my goodness, Shawntee, are you aware of this organization over here? Should we consider like branding our role with this organization to at least increase, right, the top of funnel diverse pipeline? And so it's going to be intrinsically what's of interest to you, Eric. And then and you're going to center that passion around a process or a program. And then you're going to work with the individuals, I believe, that are like directly responsible for that platform, like recruiting, and offer up suggestions and get involved. And I think you sounds like you are, and you're ready, and you're on the right path.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Well, Shawntee, do you have, go ahead, I'm sorry. Shawntee, do you have any closing comments as we wrap it up today? Or do we have any last minute questions that we want to address? So Shawntee, first of all, how's this experience been? Isn't it interesting, just the different places that people are thinking about inclusion and diversity? and just now how it's become almost corporate America's lifeline. I mean, people are still trying to understand how to make it work, how to hold the organizations accountable, and really about how to create systems. And I felt that your response to Eric was a really good first step about how we can inspire certain functions within the organization to act on creating systems. Because, you know, the beautiful thing about inclusion and diversity, it could start anywhere as long as it starts and grows and builds momentum over time. Any final comments, Shawntee?
First of all, Glenn, in terms of this format, it's amazing. An opportunity to chat with you is one, so important to me. And then in terms of the individuals that are in the audience listening, this platform to allow for them to engage directly with us, I think is awesome too, because we're all learning together. And one of the things that I know you know about me when it comes to this coined phrase as the achievement enabler. In fact, I focus my work around delivering human-centered solutions that really focus on breaking barriers to employment opportunities, Glenn, to creating equitable educational experiences. And one would say, oh, Shawntee, you're a problem solver. You connect people. And what I would say is that is true, but the why behind that is even more important for me, which is, for me, it's about holding myself accountable, right, to developing individuals on my team, leaders. As you know, I'm an educator, so students, and really anyone that's willing to grow, both personally and professionally, is what I'm going to do through conversation and through such platforms like this. You know, and as it relates to inclusion and diversity specifically, we have to start somewhere in the journey, and it is not going to be perfect. It's about doing something. And doing something means you're doing it with the spirit around ensuring that individuals can show up every day within their cultural backgrounds and experiences and perform and have a great experience at work. And that may sound very simplistic, but really that's what it is. So how do you create opportunities inside of an organization for people to be considered from all backgrounds, to be employed in any organization, and yet want to stay there? And so from a Square perspective, Glenn, we work hard to build a company where all employees feel they are valued, they're recognized, and they're able to succeed, and where diversity is celebrated and folks of all backgrounds feel they belong. And we know that culture isn't something dictated from the top down, but in fact, it's something we actively build and shape together every day at Square. So again, Glenn, thank you so much for this opportunity.
You know, first of all, you're welcome. We love to have you back so that people can actually see you more. But but your thoughts rang true, and there you are, and have tremendous wisdom. But you know, I think you simplified this, and it's not about being oversimplistic. I think that we hear the terms inclusion, equity, diversity, and it feels big. But at the core of it all, we're trying to enable, activate, elevate, and exceed one's individual capacity at work. Because for years, whether you're from a diverse background or not, we've been battling the gulf between assimilation and authenticity, feeling that pressure to be what others want us to be rather than what we seek to be ourselves, which if you go even more macro in why we have this live stream, it's how do we find the right balance between standardization and personalization? And I think everybody has they've witnessed through social unrest and the pandemic that, let's face it, standardization has gotten the best of us. And that's what happens when the business defines the individual. Now we're at a stage where the individual is defining the business. And this creates tension, and it should be healthy tension. And those that were actually born into standardization, just, you know, I was, have to recognize that we have to stop neutralizing the forces of personalization that are actually the forces that are helping us redefine what our identity is as an organization, what our identity is as an individual. And the moment that we stop stripping people of their identity, will we see systemic change. But that begins by changing the systems, because behaviors won't change if the systems remain the same. So thank you so much for sharing that, Shawntee. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. And remember, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Thank you so much, Shawntee. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you.